There is a moment no one talks about, the moment the empath reaches their breaking point. Not when they cry, not when they beg, but when they go quiet. Carl Jung warned that when a deeply empathetic person finally snaps, it doesn't look like anger, it looks like clarity, and that is why the narcissist never sees it coming. The empath has endured emotional weight, manipulation, and silent disrespect for far longer than anyone realizes, not because they are weak, but because they believe in understanding, healing, and hope. But here's the uncomfortable truth: empathy without boundaries turns into self-betrayal. And when that realization hits, something irreversible happens. The empath doesn't explode, they withdraw. They stop explaining, they stop reacting. And in that stillness, the entire power dynamic collapses. In this video, we're going deep into Jung's psychology to uncover what really happens when the empath snaps, why the narcissist panics when control is lost, and how this breaking point becomes the empath's greatest transformation. Stay with me until the end, because the final insight explains why walking away is more powerful than revenge ever could be. And if this speaks to something you've lived, don't just watch, leave a comment and claim your experience. Subscribe, not out of habit, but because this channel is where clarity replaces confusion. The empath is often misunderstood because their strength does not look loud, dramatic, or forceful. Instead, it looks like patience, understanding, and emotional endurance. Carl Jung believed that highly sensitive people tend to internalize experiences rather than act them out. And this is exactly why empaths endure so much for so long. They absorb emotional pain the way a sponge absorbs water, quietly and completely. When someone around them is hurting, angry, or broken, the empath instinctively takes responsibility for that pain, even when it is not theirs to carry. They listen longer than they should. They forgive more than is healthy. They stay silent when something hurts them, convincing themselves that understanding another person's wounds is a moral duty. Over time, this creates a dangerous pattern. The empath begins to confuse endurance with goodness, believing that if they can just tolerate a little more, love or harmony will eventually be restored. Jung warned that this kind of over-identification with suffering slowly erases the self. The empath does not notice this happening because they are focused outward, always attuned to the emotional state of others, rarely checking in with their own unmet needs. This is why they don't snap easily. Their pain is not released, it is stored. Meanwhile, the narcissist observes this patience and misreads it entirely. From their perspective, the empath's silence looks like compliance. Their forgiveness looks like permission. Their emotional availability looks like weakness. The narcissist never asks how much weight the empath is carrying because they benefit from it. They assume the empath will always be there, always absorb, always adapt. What they fail to see is that this emotional absorption works like pressure building inside a sealed container. Every dismissed feeling, every crossed boundary, every moment of being emotionally used adds another layer of pressure. The empath does not protest, not because they cannot, but because they are trying to preserve peace, connection, or meaning. Jung described this as a repression of the shadow, the parts of the self that contain anger, self-protection, and instinctive limits. When these parts are pushed down repeatedly, they do not disappear. They accumulate energy. The empath continues functioning, even appearing calm, but internally they are compressing emotional force. This compression is subtle and invisible. There is no warning sign the narcissist can easily recognize, because the empath is not threatening, shouting, or demanding change. They are enduring. This is why the breaking point feels shocking to others. When the empath finally reaches the limit, it is not because of one final incident, but because the internal storage is full. Jung understood that the psyche cannot carry unlimited pain without consequence. Eventually, the system demands balance. The empath's breaking point is not an emotional outburst, it is an internal decision, a moment of clarity where they realize that enduring is no longer virtuous and self-abandonment is not love. When that realization arrives, the pressure does not explode outward. It releases inward, reorganizing the empath's identity. They stop absorbing. They stop taking responsibility for emotions that are not theirs. They stop compressing pain to keep others comfortable. To the narcissist, this feels sudden and confusing because they never noticed the slow build-up. But from a psychological perspective, it was inevitable. The empath didn't change overnight, they reached capacity. Jung's warning was clear: when sensitive people repress their self-protective instincts for too long, the psyche will eventually correct itself, often in a way that feels final. This is why the empath's breaking point is so powerful. It is not driven by rage or revenge, but by exhaustion and truth. The empath doesn't explode, they compress until compression is no longer possible. And when that moment arrives, the shift is quiet, decisive, and irreversible. The narcissist's greatest weakness is not a lack of intelligence or charm, but a deep psychological blind spot that Carl Jung would have recognized immediately. Narcissists do not see people as separate, complex inner worlds. They see reflections, they see reactions, they see usefulness. Jung described this as ego inflation, a condition where the self-image becomes so enlarged that it blocks genuine perception. When the ego dominates the psyche, everything and everyone exists only in relation to it. This is why narcissists consistently misread empathy as submission. When an empath listens without interrupting, the narcissist assumes agreement. When the empath forgives, the narcissist assumes superiority. When the empath stays quiet, the narcissist assumes control has been secured. They never consider that empathy can exist without surrender. To them, kindness is not strength, it is a signal that the other person can be shaped, influenced, and managed. This distorted perception becomes the narcissist's fatal blind spot. Because they believe they understand power, they believe they understand people. Yet their understanding is shallow, built entirely on how others respond to them, not on who those people actually are. Jung warned that when a person lives only through the ego, they lose the ability to recognize autonomy in others. The narcissist does not relate, they extract. They look for admiration, emotional reactions, or dependence, and when they receive it, they assume the bond is permanent. This is why they cannot imagine rebellion from someone they have psychologically dominated. In their mind, the domination equals ownership. The empath has been categorized as a role, not a person, a source of validation, a stabilizer, a mirror that reflects their importance back to them. Because of this, the narcissist never studies resistance. They study control. They refine manipulation. They learn which words trigger guilt, which silences create anxiety, which emotional pressures produce compliance. But they do not study what happens when someone quietly disconnects from the game altogether. Jung would say this is because the narcissist has projected their own inner emptiness outward. Instead of developing a real relationship with the self, they depend on others to regulate their sense of worth. As long as the empath is emotionally present, the narcissist feels secure. What they do not see is that empathy does not mean erasure of the self. It means awareness, and awareness over time leads to clarity. The empath observes patterns. They feel inconsistencies. They sense the imbalance long before they name it. But the narcissist, locked inside their inflated ego, cannot imagine that the empath is gathering insight rather than surrendering. This is where the illusion becomes dangerous. The narcissist assumes the empath's loyalty is unconditional, when in reality it is conditional on meaning, safety, and mutual respect. Jung believed that the psyche seeks wholeness, not obedience. So when the empath begins to reclaim their inner boundaries, the narcissist is caught completely off guard. There is no preparation for this moment because their worldview does not allow it. In their mind, someone who once absorbed their emotions cannot suddenly step outside their influence. Someone who once cared deeply cannot simply withdraw. But this assumption reveals the blind spot itself. The narcissist never saw the empath as an independent psyche capable of choice. They saw a function, a role, a resource. So when the empath stops reacting, stops explaining, and stops offering emotional access, the narcissist experiences confusion rather than insight. They scramble to regain control because that is the only language they know. Jung would say this is the collapse of a false self-image. When the mirror no longer reflects admiration or emotional supply, the narcissist is forced to face an emptiness they spent a lifetime avoiding. But instead of learning from it, they often double down, blaming, provoking, or dismissing. What they never see is that the empath's withdrawal is not rebellion, it is self-recognition. And that is the one thing the narcissist, trapped inside their ego, cannot understand. The moment the empath truly changes is often misunderstood because it does not look like rage, revenge, or emotional chaos. Carl Jung would say it looks like integration. For a long time, the empath has lived almost entirely in the light side of their personality. They value kindness, patience, understanding, and emotional care. These traits are real and powerful, but when they are overused and unbalanced, they come at a cost. Jung called the rejected parts of the personality the shadow. This shadow contains everything a person has learned to suppress in order to be accepted or loved, including anger, firmness, self-interest, and the instinct to say no. For the empath, these traits often feel dangerous or wrong. They associate anger with cruelty, boundaries with selfishness, and assertiveness with harm. So they push these parts down, convincing themselves that being good means being endlessly accommodating. Jung warned that this repression does not make the shadow disappear. It only sends it underground, where it gathers strength. The empath's breaking point arrives when the psyche can no longer maintain this imbalance. It is not caused by a single argument or betrayal, but by the growing realization that self-denial is becoming self-destruction. At this moment, something shifts internally. The empath does not suddenly become aggressive or cold. Instead, they reclaim the parts of themselves they abandoned. They allow anger to exist without acting it out. They recognize that boundaries are not punishments, but protections. They understand that assertiveness does not erase compassion, it stabilizes it. This is the shadow awakening. Jung believed that true psychological maturity comes from holding both light and dark together, rather than choosing one and rejecting the other. When the empath integrates their shadow, their energy changes. They speak less but with more clarity. They explain less but stand more firmly. Their presence becomes calm, grounded, and unmoved by manipulation. This is why the old dynamic dies instantly. The narcissist, who once relied on guilt, emotional pressure, or confusion, finds that these tools no longer work. The empath is no longer operating from fear of conflict or fear of being misunderstood. They are operating from self-alignment. This is not rage. Rage is explosive and reactive. Shadow integration is quiet and deliberate. It does not seek to dominate or destroy. It simply refuses to participate in dysfunction. Jung described this as a form of inner authority. The empath no longer needs external validation to justify their choices. They trust their internal signals. Discomfort becomes information rather than something to suppress. Anger becomes a boundary signal rather than a weapon. This internal shift is deeply unsettling to anyone who benefited from the empath's previous self-silencing. The narcissist senses the loss of access immediately, even if they cannot explain it. The empath no longer over-explains, over-gives, or over-functions emotionally. They stop negotiating their worth. This is why the transformation feels sudden to outsiders, even though it is the result of a long internal process. Jung emphasized that ignoring the shadow leads to breakdown, while integrating it leads to wholeness. The empath's awakening is not about becoming harder or colder. It is about becoming complete. Compassion remains, but it is no longer self-sacrificing. Understanding remains, but it is no longer naive. The empath learns that strength and kindness are not opposites. When these qualities merge, the psyche stabilizes. The old cycle of emotional absorption ends because the empath no longer needs to prove goodness through suffering. The dynamic dies because the empath has stepped into psychological adulthood. When the empath meets their shadow, they do not lose their heart. They finally protect it. The empath's breaking point is often misunderstood because people expect it to look loud, dramatic, or explosive. Movies, social media, and popular culture have taught us that snapping is always a burst of anger, a shouted confrontation, or a visible meltdown. But for an empath, this moment is rarely loud. Carl Jung's psychology helps us understand why. The empath's strength lies not in outward force, but in the quiet, deliberate use of their inner power. When they reach the limit of what they can tolerate, they do not scream or lash out. Instead, they disengage. They stop giving their energy to someone who has misused it, and in that withdrawal, they create a presence that is calm, measured, and deeply unsettling. This is what makes the moment so terrifying to a narcissist. Narcissistic control relies entirely on reaction. They manipulate emotions, provoke responses, and thrive on drama. If the empath reacts, they can continue their games, twist the situation, and reassert dominance. But when the empath stops reacting, the rules of the game no longer apply. Silence replaces explanation. Calm replaces panic. Boundaries replace availability. The narcissist is suddenly confronted with a reality they cannot control or predict. Jung would describe this as the empath stepping into a state of conscious detachment where the psyche is no longer dominated by fear, guilt, or a need for approval. The empath observes, but does not participate in manipulation. They no longer absorb emotional chaos or justify the narcissist's behavior. Every previous strategy the narcissist relied on becomes ineffective because control requires the other person's emotional input. The empath's calm is not weakness. It is not passivity. It is power refined and concentrated like water slowly eroding stone. The narcissist, expecting drama, assumes something is wrong. They may panic, escalate, or try harder to provoke a reaction. But the empath remains steady, clear, and unshakable. This calm is violent in its effect, not in its method. It dismantles control structures without a single raised voice. It communicates boundaries, autonomy, and self-respect more effectively than confrontation ever could. Jung emphasized that true transformation is often invisible, unfolding internally long before it is recognized externally. For the empath, the snap is an internal decision, a refusal to participate in dysfunction, a reallocation of energy towards self-preservation, and a reclaiming of emotional sovereignty. The outward calm masks the immense inner work that has taken place, recognizing patterns of abuse, reclaiming the shadow, and realigning the self with personal truth. To the narcissist, this is terrifying because it is unpredictable. They are accustomed to control, to reading emotional cues, to bending the empath's behavior to meet their needs. But the empath's calm cannot be read, manipulated, or coerced. It is a signal that the dynamic has fundamentally shifted. Silence becomes louder than words. Detachment becomes more powerful than confrontation. Clarity replaces confusion. The empath's energy is no longer available to fuel manipulation, and the narcissist is forced to face a truth they cannot absorb or twist. They no longer have control. This moment does not create chaos. It restores order within the empath's own psyche. The narcissist feels the loss as a shock because their strategies relied on predictability and emotional reaction. What looks like quiet disengagement to the outside world is actually a seismic shift in personal power. Jung's insight reminds us that the psyche is strongest not when it reacts to every external stimulus, but when it holds its ground, integrates its full self, and acts from clarity rather than impulse. The empath's calm is terrifying precisely because it is the moment of quiet awakening, the point where the old emotional patterns dissolve and the narcissist's influence evaporates without a single shout or argument. In this way, silence becomes the most violent weapon, not through aggression, but through unwavering presence, self-possession, and the refusal to be used or manipulated any longer. When the empath finally reaches a point of withdrawal, the narcissist experiences what psychologists call a narcissistic injury, a sudden and profound shock to their sense of self. From a Jungian perspective, the narcissist has built their identity almost entirely on external validation, using others as mirrors to confirm their greatness, charm, and importance. Their self-image is inflated, but it is fragile because it depends on constant attention, admiration, and emotional supply. When the empath disengages, the supply suddenly disappears, and the narcissist is left to confront a void they have spent a lifetime avoiding, the emptiness of an unexamined self. They do not know who they are without the reactions, the admiration, or the emotional responses they have been feeding on. This absence triggers confusion, anger, and an almost frantic need to regain control. The narcissist may try every tactic in their arsenal, from guilt-tripping to gaslighting, to provoke a reaction, but nothing works. To them, control is the only form of reality they recognize. They are like a person who has depended on a mirror for their reflection and suddenly finds it gone. In this moment, they do not experience insight or growth because narcissism blocks introspection. They are incapable of using this disruption to question their behavior or develop empathy. Instead, they spiral into obsession over the person who left or over the control they have lost. Jung's psychology helps explain why this collapse is so extreme. The narcissist ego inflation is a kind of defense against the awareness of the shadow, the unacknowledged, vulnerable parts of themselves they refuse to see. The empath's withdrawal exposes the fragility of this system. Suddenly, the narcissist cannot ignore their insecurities, failures, or lack of authentic self. They feel abandoned not because they truly miss the other person, but because they have lost their source of control, their emotional fuel. This loss feels catastrophic because their identity has never been independent. It has always been relational, constructed through influence and manipulation. The narcissist reacts in ways that can appear dramatic, threatening, or obsessive. They may escalate arguments, attempt to provoke guilt, or even engage in behaviors designed to shame or punish. They may oscillate between desperate charm and furious attack, trying to reclaim the sense of power that has slipped away. But all of these reactions are superficial. They do not address the core emptiness within. Jung would point out that the narcissist is trapped in a cycle of projection and denial. They project their lack of self onto others, blaming them for perceived cruelty or abandonment, while denying any responsibility for the dysfunction in the relationship. This is why the empath's withdrawal is so effective. The narcissist cannot manipulate what is no longer available. Their old strategies, emotional pressure, seduction, provocation, fail because the empath no longer responds from fear, guilt, or obligation. The empath's calm detachment, their refusal to participate, is like removing the air from a fire. The flames of manipulation cannot continue without fuel. For the narcissist, this creates a psychological collapse. They experience frustration, confusion, and even rage, but they do not gain understanding. They may obsess over what went wrong, replay past interactions, or attempt to regain access, but insight into their own patterns is almost impossible without confronting their shadow, an unexamined self, a process most narcissists avoid at all costs. The empath, by contrast, experiences growth and liberation. Their boundaries are intact, their energy is reclaimed, and their sense of self is no longer defined by another's control. The narcissist's collapse is the natural consequence of relying on external validation instead of self-awareness. It is not about losing a person. They never truly connected with the empath as an equal, but about losing the illusion of control that has sustained them. As Jung would explain, the unexamined self cannot endure the absence of its mirrors for long, and this absence forces the narcissist into a state of psychological turbulence. They are left facing a vacuum, one that cannot be filled by charm, manipulation, or anger. The empath's withdrawal creates space, clarity, and autonomy, while the narcissist is left scrambling to reconstruct their sense of identity from the fragments of control that have been stripped away. In this way, the end of the dynamic is inevitable. The narcissist does not miss the empath as a person, they miss the control, the supply, and the illusion of dominance that the empath once provided, and this loss reveals the fragility of their carefully constructed self. The true victory for the empath does not come from confrontation, revenge, or even being right in a situation with a narcissist. It comes quietly, deeply, and profoundly through a process Carl Jung called individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole, integrated self. For years, the empath may have defined themselves through the needs, emotions, and expectations of others, constantly giving, adjusting, and absorbing. Their identity becomes entangled with the reactions and moods of the narcissist, and their sense of self may feel fragile, conditional, or invisible. When the empath finally reaches their breaking point, it is not an act of destruction, it is an act of creation. Walking away is not an emotional outburst, it is a psychological realignment. By choosing to disengage, the empath begins to reclaim the parts of themselves they have suppressed, their boundaries, their desires, their anger, their ability to say no without guilt. Jung believed that true psychological growth comes from recognizing and integrating all aspects of the self, both light and shadow, rather than surrendering to the roles others assign. The empath's so-called snap is actually the first step in this process. It is the moment they refuse to define their value by another person's need for control, admiration, or emotional supply. They begin to see themselves as separate, complete, and deserving of care, not only from others but from themselves. Individuation is not about escaping one person or situation. It is about stepping into the fullness of one's own psyche. It is a journey toward authenticity, where decisions are made from alignment with inner truth rather than fear, obligation, or manipulation. The empath learns that their emotional sensitivity is not a weakness to be exploited, but a tool for insight, creativity, and connection used wisely and selectively. This transformation does not create drama or chaos. There is no shouting, no punishment, no retaliation. The world may notice the change, but the power of the shift lies in the quiet restoration of self. The empath begins to prioritize their own well-being, their own clarity, and their own growth. Emotional energy that was once consumed by manipulation is redirected into self-care, reflection, and purposeful action. Over time, the empath's presence feels different, grounded, calm, and centered. They no longer react to every provocation or attempt at control because their sense of self is complete and self-contained. Jung would say that this is the essence of individuation, becoming whole while remaining fully human, with compassion, understanding, and emotional depth intact, but no longer dependent on external validation or fear of abandonment. The empath's relationships also change, not through avoidance, but through intentionality. They engage with others from a place of choice, not compulsion. They can give freely, but without losing themselves in the process. In this sense, the empath's so-called breaking point is actually a moment of profound liberation. By stepping away from manipulation, absorbing dynamics, and emotional exploitation, they create space to reconnect with their inner voice and true desires. The narcissist may interpret the departure as rejection, loss, or abandonment, but from the empath's perspective, it is a declaration of independence and self-alignment. The empath didn't break, they became whole. This wholeness is not earned through conflict, drama, or proving others wrong. It is earned through quiet courage, self-recognition, and the consistent choice to honor one's own mind and heart. Individuation is a lifelong journey, but the first step, the refusal to surrender identity and energy to another's control, is the moment where transformation begins. For the empath, this is the real victory, not winning against the narcissist, not reclaiming lost time, but reclaiming themselves, the internal peace, clarity, and sense of completeness that follows this step is far more powerful than any external confrontation could ever be. The empath finally exists as a full, autonomous person, no longer a mirror for someone else's ego, but a being aligned with their own truth, capable of navigating the world with insight, strength, and compassion intact.